You arrived at the Château de Châteaubriant for the late afternoon tour. You listened politely as the guide told your group about the long and rich history of the castle and this region of France. But you really weren't interested in most of what she was saying. You're here on a mission. You hid in the bathroom in the Great Hall, not wishing to disturb any of the historical artifacts on display in the 1,000-year-old building. You're only here to see a ghost. It's dark now, but you know where to go. Across the Great Hall, through the ceremonial spiral staircase, right to the Chambre dorée, the Golden Room. This is where she was murdered. You know better than to trespass on historical grounds, but you have to know if the old legends are true. Will she appear? Or all of them? Or just the blood? It's still hours before midnight. You've already been through the Golden Room on the tour, but now you have a moment to examine it more closely. The heavy red drapes and gold-trimmed molding. What holds your attention, though, is the fireplace. You can't see much inside it. It looks like a deep black yawing pit in the wall. What would this place have been like 500 years ago? What was it like to be her, a child bride who grew into a king's mistress and met a tragic end? Murdered in this room, October 16th, 1537. Midnight. Your eyes have adjusted to the dim light, and you use your cell phone to illuminate the room. You're afraid now. Not of being discovered by security, but because when the ghosts come, you're not sure what they'll do when they find you here. You can't tell where the sound is coming from. Every little noise echoes off the stone walls in the room. Your heart starts pounding. A large pool of blood catches the light from your phone, right in front of the fireplace. Welcome to Haunted Places. I'm Greg Polson. Every Thursday, I take you to the scariest, eeriest, most haunted, real places on Earth. This week, join me on a supernatural journey to the Château de Châteaubriant, a stunning castle in western France, and discover why, to this day, it's haunted. If you can't get enough haunted places, don't forget to subscribe. You can find us on your favorite podcast directory, as well as on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast, and on Twitter at Parcast Network, or on our website, parcast.com. If you like what you hear, please leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. The Château de Châteaubriant was built sometime near 1050 at the confluence of the Cher and Rola rivers in Brittany, France. Originally a wooden structure, it grew into a stronghold keep on the border of the rest of France. As it was built up, its function changed from territorial marker to aristocratic residency. The history of Château de Châteaubriant is marred with tragedy. The castle's hauntings trace back to the sudden deaths of 2 women. It all started in 1252, when a husband and wife, Sibylle de la Guerche and Geoffrey IV, torn apart by war, met an unusual and terrible end. Gilles feels the emptiness of the chateau with every footstep he takes. He's served the chateau for over 30 years. Never has it sounded so barren. Louis IX's crusade has sucked up every able-bodied man in the French countryside and sent them to the heart of Egypt. The gleam in his master's eye as he donned his armor frightened Gilles. He still saw him as the boy he helped raise, the boy who giggled as he hid about the chateau. Even as his wife grabbed Geoffrey's arm, there was something determined and possessed about the man. He dragged her through the chateau's exit with a tender force. Gilles knelt by Sibylle for hours as she cried into his shoulder. They sat there until the sun set behind the horizon and the light of the day slowly evaporated. Like the waning hope the two of them felt. It's been 3 days now. Sibylle has not left her bedchambers. Gilles brings her food and watches her eat. "He will return, madame," Gilles says softly. "I've seen war before. He will return." Sibylle's eyes flash with scorn. It takes Gilles aback, and he quickly regains his composure and continues to feed the madame. Her face softens, and she eats willingly. He says nothing more. Then, unfortunate news arrives. The war effort looks to be in vain. The soldiers are tired, and a plague is sweeping their ranks. Gilles tries to keep the news from Sibylle, but that night, she is standing in the doorway when he arrives at her chambers. She holds a torch in her hand. It illuminates her thin nightgown and her bare, pale feet. When she sees Gilles, she cocks her head with a sickly smile. Sibylle steps past Gilles with a soft determination. He tries to protest. Sibylle moves down each hallway of the chateau, whispering to herself. When Gilles works up the courage, he moves close enough to hear. "He comes. He's here. I know he's here." The words send a cold shock down Gilles' spine. He stops dead in his tracks. He's tired, and there's work to be done. He leaves the tray of food outside Sibylle's door and goes to bed. He will approach the question of her sanity tomorrow. But he cannot bring himself to. The next night, he follows Sibylle again, and then again on the next, and again, and again, and again. On one desperate night, he tries to stop her. He grabs her arm. It is the most bold thing he has done in all his years as the chateau's servant. She shrieks and pins him against the wall. The strength of the small woman catches him off guard. Her eyes are fiery and bloodshot. She starts clawing at his face, tearing bits of flesh from his cheek with each swipe of her nails. He tries to put up his hands to protect himself, but then she suddenly softens. She cocks her head as though curious as to why Gilles is there. Then she says, "He comes." Her bare feet move across the stone floor deliberately, as though each step is planned. They grow calloused with each passing day. After 2 weeks, they freely bleed against the cobblestones. "He's here." Each night, he leaves the tray of food outside her door. Each morning, it remains, full and untouched. Somehow, the madame does not grow thin. Her hair is frailed and clumps of it remain on her pillow. Her skin is sickly pale. Her feet leave bloodstains on the end of the sheets. But she does not grow thin, even without eating a morsel. "I know he's here." Gilles no longer needs to meet her at the doorway. He can find her by following the bloody footprints. The fresh ones are easy to spot. The ones caked into the stone have a cracked, stale quality to them. He feels exhausted. His eyes are heavy and dry. The wounds on his cheeks have barely healed. He can feel their stinging reminder of his transgression with each passing day. His nights are spent following the Madame, making sure she does not collapse or hurt herself in any way. And then, someone comes at night. Gilles greets the visitor at the doorway. He nearly faints with joy when he discovers it's Geoffrey, returned at last. The servants of the castle swarm him, begging for an explanation. "We thought the war was lost," they chime. Geoffrey smiles and pats them on the back in turn. "There's time for that later," he says. "First, I must see my wife." You try to stop him, but there's nothing you can say. When he sees the empty room, he turns to you. "Gilles, good man, where's my wife?" You take one wretched swallow and lead him along the path of bloody footprints. You dare not look back at the chateau's master. You find her in the east wing. You know this means she's been walking for several hours already. All you and Geoffrey can see is the pale white of her nightgown. "Sibylle!" Geoffrey says. His voice rings against the hallway walls. The pale Madame turns. Her face is as white as her nightgown. Her frazzled hair reaches in all directions. She hunches and steps forward. "Sibylle," Geoffrey says again, "aren't you cold? What in God's name are you doing out here?" Sibylle holds the flame up to Geoffrey's face. The light flickers and dances across his travel-wearied features. Gilles can feel the heat. She then pulls the light away from him and puts it upon Gilles. It's hot. He thinks the tips of his eyebrows might singe. "He's here," she whispers. Then she falls to the floor, dead. In 1252, Geoffrey IV of Château de Châteaubriant joined Louis IX in his religious crusade against Egypt. The crusade failed due to exhausted troops and a deadly plague that swept the soldiers' ranks. Geoffrey IV was captured and held in captivity by the Egyptians. After several years, a heavy ransom was paid for his release. Too weary to send word ahead, Geoffrey arrived at the Château de Châteaubriant in the middle of the night. His lonely and sleepless wife, Sibylle de la Guerche, had spent her time wandering the chateau's halls, hoping for signs of her husband. Upon the shock of seeing him returned, she died on the spot. Many say Sibylle still wanders the chateau's halls, searching for the spirit of her husband. Our story will continue in a moment after a brief message. It's not a Parcast podcast, but if you like haunted places, I think you might like The Horror of Dolores Roach, a new horror fiction podcast I found. The Horror of Dolores Roach tells a macabre urban legend of murder, betrayal, weed, gentrification, cannibalism, and survival of the fittest. When Dolores Roach returns to her old New York City neighborhood after 16 years in prison, she's stunned by all that's changed. The only person remaining from her previous life is Luis, an old stoner friend who gives her room and board in the basement underneath his dilapidated empanada shop. When the promise of her newfound stability is quickly threatened, Magic Hands Dolores is driven to extremes to survive. The Horror of Dolores Roach stars Daphne Rubin Vega and Bobby Cannavale and is written by Aaron Mark. I think it's a great podcast, but don't take my word for it. Refinery 29 says, The Horror of Dolores Roach stands out from the rest. It's totally fictional, but still equally chilling. You can listen to all episodes of The Horror of Dolores Roach now for free, wherever you get your podcasts.
As the giant grew closer, Enceladus realized something was wrong. Instead of legs, Enceladus and his brother giants slithered on two large serpents with snapping maws where the feet should be. But this giant's serpents weren't snapping, and its face sagged. An arrow whizzed past Enceladus' face. This wasn't a giant. It was a god.
You foolish, foolish giant. No one rebels against the gods and escapes unscathed.
Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, peeled off the face of a giant she'd flayed alive, revealing her own face, dripping with blood.
Parcast's New Mythology podcast dramatizes ancient myths for a modern audience and dives into their history, origins, and meaning. Hosted by my friend Vanessa Richardson, Mythology uses an ensemble cast to bring these stories to life. Every episode dramatizes an exciting story pulled from the beliefs of ancient cultures and gives insight into how our ancestors saw the universe. Stick around after this episode to hear a preview of Mythology's Part 1 on the Greek goddess Athena. New episodes come out every Tuesday. Search for and subscribe to Mythology wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, our story continues. The most significant changes to the Château de Châteaubriant began with the addition of the residential wings in the 1490s by Françoise de Dinan. Her grandson, Jean de Laval, finished the reconstruction in the 1530s. The most infamous addition was the Golden Room, a room that would become very important to the history of Château de Châteaubriant. The history starts with de Laval's wife, Françoise de Foix. Françoise de Foix was a name known all over France. She was a charming conversationalist in 3 languages, the benefit of high education and a wealthy family, connected with Queen Anne herself. She would go on to make waves as a fashionista, as well as a political influencer. She was also the first mistress of King Francis I. It was an affair that would end with de Foix shamefully returning to Château de Châteaubriant, where a jealous and enraged husband lurked and waited for revenge. It's a sunny day in 1537. De Foix is taking a walk through the beautiful gardens of the Château de Châteaubriant. The fresh air and flowers keep her company. Her husband, Jean de Laval, used to take her on walks every day through the gardens. That was before the loss of her daughter, and before the king had sent her back home once he found a new mistress. Her vibrant and exciting social life had grown dull over the years, and her husband's growing coldness had left her very lonely. She writes poetry, reads books, and continues her self-education. Her thirst for life carries on in her thirst for art. But her 20-year relationship with the king hasn't just made her husband cold and distant. It has boiled him to a slow, murderous rage. And so, she grows lonely and gives into the temptations that brought her so much joy. Before long, her writings turn to letters to King Francis I. Starved for companionship, she reaches out to her old lover as a friend, craving the stimulating conversation they once shared. And although the king was surely having more than his share of passionate moments with his new mistresses, he writes her back. Similarly starved for intellectual stimulation and missing de Foix, the two begin a correspondence that lasts for months. The king even makes the half-day journey to the Château de Châteaubriant on several occasions. They cultivate a friendship, putting aside the past. They talk and laugh. She even takes him on walks in the sunshine through her garden. De Laval can't object to his king paying a visit, but he watches in secret. He watches as his wife laughs on the arm of the king. He sees the way she's looking at him. He sees her smiling warmly and over the familiar touches. From the window high above, he watches his wife love another man. The king has left, not even an hour ago, and de Foix is still strolling the garden, humming happily to herself. He can't take it anymore. His jealousy has reached its limit. For the first time in years, he joins his wife in the garden. Grabbing her roughly by the arm, he marches her back into the castle while she struggles. Jean de Laval takes the sunshine away from her. De Foix's husband of 30 years locks her away in a room covered with black cloth, lit only by a single funerary lamp. This is the Golden Room. She pounds on the door, trying to yank it open. She screams for hours, demanding an explanation, demanding to be free. Her throat wears out and becomes raspy. She still yells, but it's muted and coarse. Each new shout makes her ever so thirsty. Her only contact is with black-clothed servants who bring her the smallest of meals, only enough to keep her alive. She tries to talk to them, pleading to be released, but they're under strict instructions not to speak to her. These are the servants she's known for years. She's laughed with them and confided in them. She cries and pleads, asking for her freedom, begging them to let her out. They ignore her cries. Soon, they become like shadows, flickering and fleeting in the firelight. She cowers in the corner when they leave her food in her chambers. Weeks pass. Her spirit is breaking. Now it takes everything she has to rise from the bed when the servants come with her meals. But she must hide from them. Their black clothing and demonic whispers are terrible to behold. Her hair is falling out, and her unbathed stench fills the room. She tries to keep track of the days by carving tally marks in the bedpost. She hasn't managed to do much more than bloody her own fingertips. Delirious with heartache and malnourished, she sticks to her sheets, covered with sweat and bed sores. Then the woman comes. She holds a torch that flickers across a thin nightgown. It is translucent, but Françoise Dufoix cannot see the body underneath. Dufoix tries to speak to her, but all that comes out is a dry croak. Her throat is raw, useless. The woman walks across the room to the bed and inspects Dufoix closely. Dufoix tries to recoil, but she's too weak to get away. The woman reaches out her hands and searches Dufoix's face. Her grimace turns sour at what she finds, and she starts to dig her fingers deeper into the flesh of Dufoix's cheeks. I know he's here. Dufoix is unsure where the voice came from. The woman did not move her lips. She feels resigned, unable even to scream, as the woman's nails tear at her skin. Then the servants come, and the woman vanishes. She exhales as they enter, relieved for once to see their ghastly forms. They do not comment on the wounds covering her face. Dufoix opens her eyes, expecting the servants with her food. 2 surgeons enter, dressed in heavy, coarse robes. Thick masks stuffed with flower petals conceal their faces, and glassed lenses reflect the torchlight of de Laval's 4 armed guards. Defoy did not think she even had the energy to be afraid. The appearance of the surgeons changes that instantly. They poke and prod her with their wooden rods. These rods are not weapons. They're used for treatment of the sick. She tries to reach out to them, to pull them close enough to explain, "I'm not sick," she wants to shout. But she's too weak to speak. And the gasping noises she makes fall on deaf ears. They carry sharper instruments, wrapped in black cloth, also for use on the sick. They step back and unpack them. It wasn't unusual to have guards present with patients. Memories of the Black Plague still ran through every city in France. Preventing the spread of disease was a brutal affair, and the afflicted were often treated against their will. Defoy knows what comes next. If she can't explain herself, if she can't reason with the guards or doctors, she will die. She reaches out toward them, trying to say something, anything. She manages to croak out, "Please help." Thin, sweating, barely able to move. Her fingers are covered with crusted blood. The skin on her neck and face dawn scabs and sores from her incessant scratching. Her breath is stale and reeks. That's all the evidence they need. With a gesture, the guards lurch at her. The doctors work quickly. They quickly open her arms and legs with their instruments. They know exactly where to cut. Wrist to shoulder, 2 deep slices. Inner thigh to ankle, 2 more slices. The guards don't need to hold her any longer. Françoise Defoy is weak from her imprisonment and dies quickly, covered in her own blood, in a room full of strangers, while her husband watches. The epitaph on her tombstone reads in part, "Here lies a nothing that once triumphed over all." On October 16th, 1537, at the age of 42, Françoise Defoy died in the golden room of the Château de Châteaubriant. Every year for nearly 500 years, on that night, people have reported seeing something there. Some say they can see Françoise Defoy pacing in her room, waiting to finally be let out. Some say they've also seen Jean de Laval with her, making sure, even in death, that she will never escape. Our story will continue in a moment, right after the break. And now, back to our story. It wasn't always called the Golden Room. Centuries of new lords and deterioration means a lot of redecorating. Sometime in the 1630s, this chamber was redone with an Italian flair, and all of its gold trimming were added. No easy task holding the decor up to the standards of royalty. The work normally reserved for summer takes months and months, leading well into autumn, into October. It's October 16th. Working around the clock to finish, one of the workers takes a much-needed rest from his back-breaking work. It's not wise to sleep on the job, but it's late at night, and better to take a little break than get sloppy. He puts his tools aside and sits in the corner of the room. He's just planning to rest his arms and aching legs. But he's so exhausted, and it's so late, that he falls almost immediately asleep. There's a single work lamp hanging nearby, but after a few hours, it goes out. It's completely dark now, and nearing midnight. Almost as soon as he closes his eyes, he jolts awake. Something's wrong. He grabs his nearby tools, groggily thinking the master of the house has caught him resting on the job. But the room is completely empty, and he's alone. The hair on his arm stands up. Something about the room commands his attention. The more he looks, the more confused he becomes. Nothing is out of place here. He can see the entire room clearly, despite the late hour. The room is well lit by the ornate golden fireplace. The fireplace, that's what woke him. He didn't light it. He was working by the light of a single lantern. One of the castle servants must have come back to check on him and lit it so he could continue his work. The golden room must be finished soon, and he's already wasted too many hours on idle slumber. He still feels like he's being watched in an empty room. He stares into the dim golden lighting, the subtle unquiet of an angry presence closing in on him. Dressed in filthy, stained robes, a woman appears in the corner. He tries to tell himself that she must have walked through the door, that sleep is playing tricks on him. But as she paces slowly by the bed, a pool of blood appears by the fireplace, not creeping out from under the molding or seeping in from between the stones. The woman barely makes a sound as she walks rhythmically back and forth across the room. Every once in a while, she walks to the door of the chamber and bangs against it furiously. Her mouth opens in what would be a scream, except nothing comes out. Now, he notices the heat from the fire doesn't quite touch him. The room is still cold. He reaches his hand out to the fire. It goes out. He stands, hoping to make a speedy exit. The woman stops pacing when he stands. She stops moving entirely. He starts sweating, despite the chill. He takes a step toward the door. The ghost of Defoy turns her head toward him. He can't tell if the expression on her face is fear or anger. She's standing between him and the door. He doesn't breathe as they stand there, facing each other. Her arms reach out for him, and he can see the open, bleeding wounds. Her mouth is twisted in a silent scream as she grabs him and pushes him roughly into the fireplace. Now, he can feel the heat of the fire. Every year, on the anniversary of her murder, Françoise Defoy appears in the golden room at the Château de Châteaubriant. She paces the room as though looking for a way out, looking for a way to avoid her imminent death. However, sometimes she's not alone. At the end of the French Revolution, the chateau was sold and resold. It changed hands many times, but the haunted lore that surrounded it stayed firm. By the mid-1800s, it had been placed under historical protection as a national landmark. A clerk named Hugo inspects the chateau to ensure it is being properly preserved. The castle has had many additions since Defoy was murdered, and Hugo takes his time, going room by room. He inspected the golden room hours earlier, making sure he wouldn't be there at midnight. Not that he believed in ghosts, but better safe than sorry. He's in the middle of the great hall, taking notes on the last few things on his list, when, on the other side of the great hall, past the ceremonial staircase, he hears them before he sees them. Hugo tells himself it's a joke, or maybe someone from the Monument Society has come to check on his progress. He can only lie to himself for a moment before they appear. A procession of ghostly monks walks somberly across the room. Their heads are bowed, and he can't make out their faces, but there's something sad in their gait. They walk slowly across the dim hall, reluctant to revisit the room where Dufois was murdered. Orange, wispy light dances against a distant wall. The fireplace in the golden room has been lit. Some part of the clerk's mind notes that he can't smell the smoke or kindling. A new spirit joins the march. This one stands at the head of the procession, guiding them sternly, walking with a restrained formality. He knows this must be de Laval, the once scorned husband. They ripple in the moonlight, edging closer to the golden room. De Laval and the monks don't seem to notice the clerk, and he's perfectly fine not being seen. Flanking him now are two plague doctors in full surgical cloaks. They turn to look at Hugo through masks with long, pointed noses. Before he can react, they're out of sight, on their way to the golden room. And then, finally, she appears. Dufois, draped in white. Her eyes seem to shine in the dark. She has her head down. Her hands are folded neatly. As the clerk watches her walk out of sight and toward the orange light of the fireplace, he feels a stab of sadness pierce through his fear for a moment. He feels compelled to follow, compelled to see the procession to its end. Midnight is over. The fire is gone. The monks are gone. De Laval stands with the doctors, flanking him. He points at Dufois. Her skin is covered in sores and scratches. The doctors nod and approach her, until Dufois directs her spindly arm at Hugo. Her long, bony finger juts out at him in accusation. Hugo is struck at first with shock, but then he looks at his arms, and to his horror, he understands. They're covered in boils, red and oozing with pus. The doctors turn their heads to follow Dufois' pointed finger. They see Hugo, and their eyes alight with hunger. They advance, stakes tapping against their palms. They will not let the plague get out. Blood flecks out of Hugo's mouth and drips down his chin. He trips over his own feet and collapses. His body screams with deep aches, and he's burning up under his clothes. Dufois is gone. The doctors approach, their sharp instruments gleaming in the firelight. His boils begin to fill with pus and burst, each one like a tiny dagger in his face and torso. He's getting weaker by the moment. There's only one thing these surgeons do to cure Hugo. Some say that on the anniversary of Françoise Dufois' death, you see more than just the ghost of the woman. You might see a full procession, complete with the ghosts of monks, plague doctors, and de Laval himself. So it's been, for hundreds of years, blood, priests, Dufois. Every October 16th, she shows herself, trapped forever in the bloody night she died, maybe trying to warn us, hoping some young woman who's still alive will learn to avoid toxic men. Or maybe she just wants to be remembered, if not for her amazing life, then for her brutal death. And let's not forget about Sibylle de la Guerche, the woman who still looks tirelessly for one last glimpse of her missing husband. But be warned, the ghosts of Château de Châteaubriant died as tortured women, and their visits to the chateau are nothing if not inspired by pain. Thanks for listening to Haunted Places. Don't forget to subscribe to Haunted Places on Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or any other podcast directory. If you like what you hear, leave a 5-star review or tell us what you think on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram as @Parcast and Twitter @Parcast Network. It seems simple, but it really helps our show. A new episode comes out every Thursday. We'll see you next week. Haunted Places was created by Max Cutler. It's a production of Cutler Media and is part of the Parcast Network. It's produced by Max and Ron Cutler. Sound design by Ron Shapiro, with production assistance by Paul Mahler. Additional production assistance by Maggie Admire and Carly Madden. Haunted Places is written by Travis McMaster. I'm Greg Polson. And now, please enjoy this preview of Mythology's first episode on the Greek goddess Athena.
It was foolish to challenge the gods. After battling the goddess Athena for 3 days, Enceladus had all but resigned himself to the fate of so many of his fellow giants. But he'd escaped her for the moment, and perhaps that would become his advantage. Enceladus had barely caught his breath when he heard the horses. He whipped around, worried Athena had tracked him to the Ionian Sea, but it was one of Enceladus' own, another giant. As the giant grew closer, Enceladus realized something was wrong. Instead of legs, Enceladus and his brother giants slithered on 2 large serpents with snapping maws where the feet should be. But this giant's serpents weren't snapping, and its face sagged. An arrow whizzed past Enceladus' face. This wasn't a giant. It was a god.
You foolish, foolish giant. No one rebels against the gods and escapes unscathed.
Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, peeled off the face of a giant she'd flayed alive, revealing her own face, dripping with blood. She kept the skin wrapped around her like a cloak. Enceladus's leg serpents snapped and spit at Athena, but their fangs couldn't pierce the hide of his own kind. It was a perfect shield. Athena knocked Enceladus into the Ionian Sea. Then she crouched down and lifted the entire isle of Sikolos. Athena had a divine, godly strength. Plucking an island out of the ocean was as easy for her as it was for a man to pick up his child. Athena straightened up, raising the island above her. She swung it around over Enceladus and slammed the island on his head. Enceladus crumpled under the blow of the island. He sank and then vanished beneath the landmass. His blood and anger rippled outward from the island. The place where Enceladus was defeated became Mount Etna, and the buried giant was reduced to expressing his wrath through eruptions and earthquakes. Yet something wasn't right. As she watched steam build above Mount Etna, Athena knew her heart was missing a piece. She'd used her wisdom and wit to defeat the enemy, embracing her role as a goddess of war, and it felt empty. She was destined for something greater. She was certain. Welcome to Mythology on the Parcast Network. Every Tuesday, we present dramatic stories from ancient mythology and explore their origins. I'm your host and narrator, Vanessa Richardson. Today, we're focusing on the Greek goddess Athena. She's the goddess of war and military strategy, but also the goddess of wisdom, civilization, and the arts. In her mythology, she's caught between who she is and who she wants to be. New episodes of Mythology release every Tuesday, and you can find us and all of Parcast's podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts. At Parcast, we are grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network. And if you enjoy today's episode, the best way to help us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. It really does help us. We also now have merchandise. Head to parcast.com/merch for more information. Something to note in these episodes: all Greek myths have many versions and variations. We've selected those we felt are the most dramatic and entertaining, and supplemented them with additional research into Greek traditions. Additionally, each Greek myth takes place in a wide, expanded universe. While we'll cover some major myths of Athena over the next few episodes, this won't be her only appearance in the podcast. Goddess of the arts and of war, Athena exhibits a dichotomy in Greek culture. She's a woman warrior in a culture where women didn't go to war, and a household goddess who vowed to never be a lover or a mother. Athena is masculine, feminine, and something greater than both. She's a goddess for everyone, and a goddess for no one. Ancient Greek society had clear gender roles, treating women as second-class citizens. But Athena exists outside that construct. She'll skin a giant alive and then go weave a tapestry. She's as apt to teach men gardening and pottery as she is to help them slay their enemies. Unlike her half-brother and rival, Ares, the war god, Athena approaches war with logic and meditation. At the start of a battle, Ares leaps into action, while Athena waits, plans, then leads men to bloody victory. She values rational thinking over emotion, but is not without rage and bloodlust. Classicist Walter F. Otto characterized Athena as the goddess of nearness because she was always beside the Greek heroes in battle, guiding their spears and swords. She is, like all Greek gods, a killer. However, Athena prefers to change errant humans into other forms, doling out punishments while preserving life. She also transforms herself, taking a male appearance multiple times in the Iliad and the Odyssey. That isn't to say she doesn't embrace a female role too. In today's myths, the building of the Palladium, the judgment of Paris, and the story of Arachne, Athena strives to be recognized as feminine, and this may be the hardest battle the goddess of war has ever fought. The king of the gods had a headache, and Zeus's son Hephaestus, like many children, was only making it worse. Hephaestus was god of the forge, born with a clubfoot. To him, a headache was nothing.
And then I realized I could put another axe head on my existing axe and kill 2 men with 1 blow. Genius, right?
Oh, my head is killing me.
That's the idea. Both heads could kill. 2 heads, 1 axe.
Zeus gestured to his forehead, frustrated.
It feels like my skull is expanding and contracting. Maybe I should go...
Oh, headache. I thought we were still on axe heads.
Zeus continued moaning as he dropped to the floor, gripped his head, and rocked back and forth. Hephaestus looked on, torn between sympathy and opportunity.
Anything I can do? Maybe take over your duties for a time? Not that a headache could ever take down the great god Zeus.
Oh, Hephaestus, will you... Oh.
Hephaestus eyed his brand new double-headed axe. Then Zeus doubled over in front of him. The opportunity was ripe. Zeus had overthrown Hephaestus' grandfather. Perhaps patricide ran in the family.
Oh, make it stop. End it. Cut off my head.
Hephaestus hid his grin as he grabbed his double-head axe. After today, the gods of Mount Olympus would bow to Hephaestus. He wound up and aimed straight for Zeus's skull. The axe cleaved Zeus's head in half. As Zeus's eyes spread wide apart, a battle helmet emerged from where his brain should have been. Hephaestus dropped his axe in shock as a fully armored warrior woman sprang from Zeus's head, shouting a battle cry. All thoughts of ruling Mount Olympus faded in the face of this fearsome, beautiful goddess. Ready for battle, Athena stepped out of her father's head and into the light of Mount Olympus. Athena was born without a mother, the child of Zeus alone. She emerged a rational adult, capable of complex thought, and ready to fight for her life. Yet because the Greek gods are modeled on humans, with human flaws and emotions, there is one story of Athena's childhood and a youthful accident that guided the rest of her life. Zeus was accustomed to his children having a mother, so after he fused his head back together, he wasn't sure what to do with Athena. Eventually, the single dad sent his new daughter away to be educated by his nephew, Triton. Triton was a fish-tailed ocean god, so Athena spent much of her time in and around water, and more of her time with Triton's daughter, Pallas. Pallas was a water nymph, a maiden of the ocean, and Athena's only friend. But today, the war goddess and the water nymph raised their swords, squaring off against each other. The pair sparred on the surface of a lake. Pallas floated amid a column of waves, her long hair and shimmering fishtail distracting from her killer aim. Athena defended herself from atop a sleek raft, wearing armor as always. She pushed her sword forward, calling out her moves as she executed them.
Striking, stabbing,
Dodging.
ducking, and slicing.
Lunging.
As Pallas lunged, Athena used her shield to knock Pallas over. Rising from the waves, Pallas spit water into Athena's face.
Hey!
Pallas spouted more water, somehow forming it into perfect concentric circles, like aquatic smoke rings. Athena couldn't help but laugh.
Pallas, be serious. My father's coming to watch us spar tomorrow. We have to impress him.
You have to impress him. If I impress him, you know where I'll end up. And my father won't be happy about that.
You're filthy.
You've heard the stories, and you have 100 half-siblings to prove it.
37. I have 37 half-siblings.
That's an army, warrior goddess.
Let's go again. I want to get that spinning parry right.
Athena was quite skilled in combat. It helped that she took to it naturally, like Pallas to water. She'd been ecstatic to hear Triton declare that they were finally good enough to spar in front of Zeus. The proud fathers had invited a crowd of gods, nymphs, and even a few mortals they fancied. Rowing out onto the lake, Athena fiddled with her helmet. She knew her armor made her look ferocious, but she still felt like a child in a woman's body. What if she fell off her raft? What if her mind went blank and she froze? What if her father, the king of the gods, thought she was only average? A terrifying column of water arose from the depths. Inside it, Pallas. She met Athena's eye and flashed a quick smile. Athena relaxed. She wasn't alone. She had Pallas. With her best friend beside her, Athena had nothing to worry about. They began to spar. In the audience, Zeus watched intently. Next to him, his wife, Hera, the goddess of marriage, looked around, intent in a different way.
Aphrodite has such a nice nose, don't you think?
Sure. That's it. Slice and dodge. Well done.
You've never noticed it?
I guess it's fine, if you like noses.
It looks quite like Athena's.
Don't start on this again.
I don't understand why you...
She's going to fall in the water.
A wave crashed over Athena, soaking her. Athena slipped, but kept her footing on the raft.
Come on, Athena. You can do it. Get back up there. Raise that sword. You'll win this yet.
They aren't actually fighting. It's a mock spar.
At the end of which, my daughter will win.
Zeus nervously watched Athena struggle through the next few maneuvers.
She's going to fall and embarrass us.
Us? She does have a mother. I knew it.
I meant Athena and myself.
As Zeus worried, Athena relaxed into the rhythm of the spar. She breathed deeply as she pressed her shield against Pallas's sword. Her instincts took over. Suddenly, a new heat rushed through Athena's veins. She'd never felt this warrior power before, but it possessed her. Her feet danced more nimbly. Her sword twisted more sharply. She tasted metal in her mouth. For the first time, she might want to kill. Across the lake, Zeus adjusted his shield. The sun gleamed off of it. Getting an idea, he tilted his shield, aiming the ray of light at Pallas. In the water, the light caught Pallas's eye. She looked up. Meanwhile, Athena stabbed toward Pallas's heart, a final flourish. The perfectly executed move she was born for. This was her gift: combat. Athena lunged, expecting Pallas to dodge as they had rehearsed. She didn't notice that Pallas's face was tilted up, distracted. Pallas looked toward Zeus as Athena's sword pierced her heart. Instead of blood, water flowed from Pallas's wound. She shrank, dissolving, until all that was left were her eyes, which transformed into two wiggling minnows. Pallas was dead. If you enjoyed listening to this preview of our episode on Athena and want to hear the rest of it, search and subscribe to Mythology wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes release every Tuesday.